and welcome to Africa Today. I am Esther Mokwariola. If you have been following global developments from Africa, you would notice that quite a number of summits have held lately, from the African Union Summit in July to the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation in September, and the just concluded 73rd United Nations General Assembly in New York. But some summits don't just get as much attention as others, like the 8th Conference of the Parties to the World Health Organization Framework Convention on Tobacco Control in Geneva, where delegates are discussing the future of the addictive substance on the road to a healthier and sustainable world. And so we ask, what are your thoughts on global and regional efforts on tobacco use and control? You can join the conversation and share your thoughts with us on Twitter at TVC News NG. We take a report, and Africa Today will continue. Welcome on board.
Nigeria must take its rightful position on leadership in Africa to incorporate tobacco control into the Sustainable Development Agenda. This is the view of the Nigeria Tobacco Control Alliance, which seeks to promote campaign on the ills associated with tobacco and the need for government to generate revenue through tobacco taxation. The board chairman of the alliance, Oluwafemi Akinlode, says the Sustainable Development Goals envisions a future safe from the worst effects of tobacco and advocates increased taxation on tobacco.
Tobacco happens to be one of the major risk factors for NCDs. And for you to reduce NCDs, you have to reduce tobacco consumption. And there are sets of measures contained in the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control that governments around the world can use to reduce consumption. And the UN had also, in 2015, adopted FCTC implementation, and one of the major tools to achieve SDG goal number 3, which is right for all.
We can only ask the government to raise as much taxes they can raise from tobacco and use that same taxes to fund development, to fund medical infrastructures and all that, such that the main essence, which is the public health, could actually gain while they are mitigating tobacco, and such that tobacco use could go down.
The World Health Organization recommends a tobacco tax policy of 75% excise tax, which will yield a large decrease in tobacco use, especially among the poor. The group hopes that the government will introduce radical tax policies for tobacco products. To that effect, it hopes the government will include tobacco control in their sustainable development priorities, increase excise duty on tobacco products to such extent that tax revenues realized can be used to fund sustainable development, and commence enforcement of provisions of the NTCA Act 2015, among others.
Welcome back. Now, before we get into the discussion of the day, let's update you on some of the top news stories around Africa. An opposition contender who will seek election in Cameroon's impending presidential polls has alleged that a massive fraud is underway to ensure the sitting president wins a 7th term. Mozambican authorities say 90 people have died since Islamist militants' attacks began last year in northern province of Cabo Delgado. The group, known locally as Al-Shabaab, has no known links to the jihadist group in Somalia. Congolese Dr. Denis Mukwege have won the 2018 Nobel Peace Prize for their work in fighting sexual violence and conflicts around the world. Well, he shares this year's prize with Yazidi campaigner Nadia Murad. Now joining me to look at tobacco consumption and control, I have Cyril Abaku, a TVC News in-house researcher. On Skype, I have Babatunde Irukera, Director General, Consumer Protection Council in Nigeria, and he joins me from Geneva in Switzerland. Well, earlier, Dr. Sage Ehanire, Nigeria's Minister of State for Health, spoke on Nigeria's agenda at the treaty talks in Geneva.
Very high priority on pushing the agenda of tobacco control. our primary interest here is the burden, the rising burden of non-communicable diseases, NCDs. Many of them linked directly with tobacco consumption. So this burden is such that, in fact, we just last month started a step survey to fully understand the extent and the responsibility which lies with the Ministry of Health is not just to cure, but to prevent. That is why our interest in tobacco control is very strong. We are not at war with tobacco industry. We want to protect our citizens. We want to reduce the burden of non-communicable diseases, cardiovascular diseases, cancers, and pulmonary diseases, which are linked to the tobacco consumption. We work very well with civil society organizations and other NGOs. In fact, they have been very, very good and strong partners in levels. There are many areas where they have helped in Nigeria Tobacco Act, Control Act, and in the areas of pushing legislation that led to the ban of flavor tobacco and raising tax from 16 to 23%. We want to continue working on that with as partner countries to scale up the taxation in order to make it less affordable for young people to the expected WHO recommended 70% of the sale price. So the civil society organization has provided very good support, and we continue to work with them in order to drive this agenda.
Well, before we begin our discussion, let me welcome our guests, formerly Cyril Abaku and Babatunde Irukera. Thank you for your time on Africa Today.
Thank you, Esther. I'm glad to be here.
Now, let me begin with Babatunde Irukera, Director General of the Consumer Protection Council in Nigeria, who is in Geneva right now. Could you give us a brief insight on the outcome of the Conference of Parties just held in Geneva?
Well, thank you for your question. The Conference of Parties has not concluded. We've still got a late-night committee engagement and negotiations. Hopefully, the plenary would end the conference tomorrow, and then it would transition into a meeting of parties. However, the past few days have been quite intense, and for the most part, discussing where tobacco control is right now and where it needs to be going. Key issues have been the structure of the tobacco control community under the framework and how it should continue to operate, funding the framework and the activities of the Secretariat. Other key control issues have been TAPs, that's tobacco advertisement and sponsorship, motions and sponsorship. Then issues surrounding provisions in the framework on how global cooperation and international corporations can promote control, whether it's in areas of liability, which is typically the judicial process, and then in other areas such as emerging new products, new delivery systems, and smokeless tobacco, and essentially all the trends in the industry and on the control side, and how countries can come together to more effectively control tobacco, especially from young people.
All right, now these key control issues, Babatunde, could you walk us through the aspects that will be looked into? What areas are you looking at? Is this conference looking at curbing tobacco consumption in Africa?
Oh, without question. In actual fact, everything I mentioned now are key areas that the conference has considered. You're talking about 5 plenary sessions, 2 committees holding approximately 9 to 10 meetings each on different issues. The framework is set up in different articles, and I want to say almost a dozen articles have been the subject of deliberation, decisions, consensus, sometimes even disagreements in this past week. However, with respect to Africa, there's also the Africa region. And what we did in the Africa region was, prior to coming to Geneva, we had met. In addition to that, and in the period we've been in Geneva, every morning we have a forum briefing where, as a region, we attempt to adopt a unified position. Africa's situation is somewhat peculiar in the sense that the vast majority of countries in Africa are developing or emerging economies. And so you've got to recognize that the tobacco control issues there are perhaps more emergent and certainly more urgent than in some other environments. And so even with all the regular other control issues like advertisement, cross-border trading, illicit trafficking of tobacco products, and distribution of tobacco products during hostilities or in times of complex emergencies, there are issues that affect us somewhat differently. The public health issues, the diseases that are caused by tobacco are the same all over the world, but the public health apparatus in some of these other countries is very different from what we have in Africa. And so that's why as a region it was very helpful that we could come together, take positions that would assist us with being more influential, or at least having a more compelling case when we went into the plenaries. But a few things jump out at me that I think have been very critical to the continent in this past week. One of them is advertising, promotion, and sponsorship. Another one is transparency and the nature of the interaction between the tobacco companies and governments and other regulatory institutions, and the nature of the disclosures. And interestingly, Nigeria took the lead of the rest of the world by signing off mandatory disclosures. And so those are some of the most important things. I think another important thing is really just the future of tobacco products themselves and what kind of products are emerging, especially the devices for discharging the tobacco and then the different flavors.
Okay, let's quickly go on a quick break now. You're watching Africa Today, and we've been looking at tobacco consumption and control in Africa. Stay with us for more in just a moment. While treaty talks has witnessed progress in previous years, experts are worried about how low and middle-income countries continue to bear the brunt of the tobacco burden in terms of healthcare costs and deaths. Tobacco consumption has fallen substantially in the last 30 years, but smoking is still responsible for at least 6 million deaths every year. So, Cyril, before we went on break, we just heard the Director General of Consumer Protection Council talking about what was discussed at the Conference of Parties in Geneva and hopes to control consumption of tobacco in Africa and Nigeria's role in all of this. But from your perspective, how satisfied are you with the level of tobacco control we get to see in our continent?
It's not just Africa. I think the Eastern Mediterranean and Africa have have similarities. He rightly mentioned Africa because regulations are lax, monitoring is also weak, but you find the population is growing. Now in Africa alone, where in the past 35 years, it's been estimated that growing has increased by 50%. If you check that same trend in the developed nations, it has reduced, which means that by and large, if they say that I won't admit it now or will admit it later, that tobacco consumption has become an African challenge, so to speak. And that I think we need to declare a state of emergency. It has reached a crisis level. I, for one, I won't sit down and imagine that if the global, if as it is said, the global economy for tobacco is estimated to be around $1 trillion. And Nigeria alone accounts for 90 billion naira annually on tobacco consumption. That is a huge market for any investor to look away from so easily. That's one. It's not that over these years there have not been frameworks. When we were growing up as little children, tobacco advertisements were on TV and radio.
Right.
And then in the end, they said tobacco smoking
And
is
liable
dangerous.
to-
No,
it's
initially they said
detrimental-
it's dangerous to your
dangerous to
health.
health.
Later on, it became
And liable to die
yes,
young.
to die young. And the question we always asked was, why don't even take away these adverts from TV? It's a good thing that the political will came up and then adverts were taken away from television, but the market still grew. It tells us that there is much more to it than what we see. If a low-income earner can still walk into a shop
Kiosk.
after he has taken his day pay, let's say he lives on a daily rate of $1, he can walk into a shop and buy a stick or 2 sticks of cigar. The estimate is that the average Nigerian buys about 10 sticks per day. So if you can walk into the shop to buy a stick, it shows that we are still very porous, because nobody should be allowed to buy retail cigarette, if they must buy. But like Michael Bloomberg also said, the former mayor of New York, he said, look, the most potent regulatory mechanism against tobacco has been taxation. But yet, Esther, it is the least widespread of all the measures.
Right.
Because while those who are anti-tobacco are fighting, the brands, the big brands, across the world, are also subtly pushing their own agenda. And so there's a war, there's a clash, there's a confrontation. We may not see it daily, but they are seeing that there's a huge market here, there's a potential here, and that if they continue to push, they're going to be making gains. The gains they can no longer make in their own economies, they are seeing that they can make it over here in their own economies. They are seeing that they can make it over here. And what else? I mean, the market is growing. More young people are, more people are moving to the urban centers. And as they're moving, there are lifestyle issues, that come with that. They are what they eat, whom they relate with. And look, one of the things about cigarette is that, in a way, tobacco is that smoking tends to give people some sort of affiliation or association, that sense of belonging. So how do we begin to reorientate people's minds? While we are dealing with taxation, I don't know how much they pay in Nigeria as tax, but what they pay for taxes shouldn't be less than 50%.
So in other words, a whole lot needs to be done if we're talking about tobacco
The
control.
journey is still very far. And for me, I think that this meeting in Geneva, for instance, we should begin to realize that our attention should be paid on what is happening in Africa and Eastern Mediterranean, because the issue has significantly shifted from where it was to where it is going now.
Right, point taken now, Cyril. Now to another thing, advocates at the 8th Conference of the Parties to the World Health Organization Framework Convention on Tobacco Control shared their thoughts on the biggest barriers in implementing the treaty.
The industry recognizes that the Global Tobacco Treaty is the single greatest tool that governments have to reverse the tobacco epidemic that kills 7 million people every year. And the governments are working to advance this implementation so that they can reverse the fact that 7 million people die from the tobacco epidemic every year, and they're working to hold the industry accountable. The industry recognizes this tool and will do everything in its power to block, weaken, and delay progress and anything that affects its profits. The single greatest barrier to implementing the Global Tobacco Treaty is actually industry interference, which includes, as Bobby can talk about a little bit more, the pushing of false solutions like e-cigarettes.
As the tobacco industry is circumventing laws and other e-cig industries by electronic nicotine delivery systems, this is a circumvention. This is another tactic of the tobacco industry to expand its markets, to renormalize the industry. This is a huge lot is at stake. We cannot afford to reverse the public health gains and social which has been made, and also the gains which have been made in holding the industry accountable.
Well, I still have on Skype Babatunde Irukera, Director General of the Consumer Protection Council in Nigeria, and he is in Geneva, Switzerland. Mr. Irukera, now there is this controversial electronic nicotine delivery systems, which is touted as less harmful. Now, do you see this as a threat to tobacco control efforts in Nigeria and other low and middle income countries?
Well, here's what it is. And you must ask yourself what ends really is. In some sense, there is some science that the industry seeks to advance, that what ends really is a safer alternative, in the sense that they believe that there was the combustion that was really most harmful to health in the regular cigarette. And so with ends, you don't have the burning, so there's no combustion. However, that science itself is also very suspect and controversial, because fundamentally, tobacco delivers nicotine. Nicotine is addictive. A lot of the components in the regular cigarette still remains in ends. As a matter of fact, there is a possibility for a lot more consumption with ends because of flavors and all that that makes it far less harsh than the regular cigarette. And so I'm not sure that there is, I don't know that you can have something safer when it still hurts. It's not, it's not driving, it's not flying.
Right.
It's something you consume. And so if you say that, you know what, you can keep consuming this, it won't kill you as much as it would have before, then the argument of whether it is safe becomes very questionable. And yes, it's something that we should be concerned about in Nigeria. The reason is that we've had all these years of ultimately working very hard, using our culture and a bunch of other things to advance the now prevailing narrative that cigarette smoking is socially unacceptable, certainly as a lifestyle choice, and health-wise is unacceptable too.
Yeah.
But unless we're careful and proactive,
Right.
and reverse all that work.
So what should Nigerians expect of the Consumer Protection Council after the Conference of Parties?
Oh, one of the things that, one of the resolutions that has come out of this meeting so far is that there's a lot more clarity on how we need to approach regulation of some of these newer tobacco products. And the Consumer Protection Council would certainly step up to the plate. Earlier on this year, the Minister of Health sent a directive to the Consumer Protection Council asking the Consumer Protection Council to begin the implementation of the National Tobacco Control Act of 2015. And so we had identified areas of enforcement that we were going to be proceeding upon. One of them was that we initiated a new standards review to for the NIS, the Nigerian Industrial Standards, on packaging and labeling to be more, to be consistent with the Act. That has happened, and that's about to become enforceable. And there are a few other things, but what we have learned from being here is that there are a few other things that we need to also begin to do, especially with the emerging products, and how to make sure that we are not coming from the back to try and regulate
All right,
again.
let's leave it at that for now. Thank you very much, Babatunde Irukera, Director General, Consumer Protection Council. We appreciate your analysis on Africa Today. Now, Cyril, before we wrap up the show, closing moments, what would you say, where do you see this leading to? How can we deal with this in a nutshell?
Look, I think if we agree that tobacco smoking is dangerous to the human health, and we also agree that factually speaking, that it is the leading cause of preventable death in Nigeria, why do we have up to as much as 164 billion cigarettes in Sub-Saharan Africa alone 2 years ago? So governments can say, we won't allow you to bring in figure, say in a month or in a year. That will significantly reduce, and then even for the few that are coming, we must impose high taxes, because the ultimate goal is that we want to put an end to this. Since it's a recipe for death, nobody should encourage it, and we don't want it also. Having said that, again, we also need to now carry out a serious enlightenment campaign to people, to the rural communities, urban centers, that lifestyle does not have to include smoking. That there are better ways that people can enjoy life without having to resort to tobacco smoking. I think if we do that, it's better when people can withdraw from it. Ultimately, that's more organic for me.
All right, thank you very much, Cyril Abaku, researcher, TVC News, in-house researcher, TVC News. Thank you for your insights as well on the show.
My pleasure, anytime.
Well, it's way past May the 31st when Africa joins the global community to annually mark World No Tobacco Day. And it is impressive to note that how advocacy on issues have gone from being a 24-hour observance to becoming an everyday conversation. Well, going forward, preventing dire health and socio-economic consequences would entail a more relentless awareness campaign and aggressive interventions in tobacco control within the continent and around the world. And that is our package for tonight. But don't forget to join the conversation as usual on Twitter at TVC News NG and follow me for updates around Africa at Esther TVC News. Until the next one, I am Esther Omokwariola, and always remember, Africa can only get better.